But in essence, what you see is someone who seemingly is really full of rage and anger, and they push the other person away. When they're alone, they feel incredibly uncomfortable. This is the kind of person they'll call you late at night just to talk on the phone, and they don't want to get off the phone with you. Why? Because they don't want to face those feelings of being alone. They're too painfully difficult. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In an earlier episode, episode 11, we began to explore the complex and often misunderstood topic of narcissistic rage. In that episode, we delved into the distinctions between three powerful emotions: anger, rage, and hatred. The main focus of that episode was to help listeners understand that while these emotions are often used interchangeably, they have distinct characteristics and play different roles in relationship dynamics. We explored how anger, at its healthiest, is a natural response to perceived threats or frustrations and can lead to communication and conflict resolution when expressed constructively. We also discussed rage, characterized by overwhelming outbursts that often escalate into aggressive or destructive behaviors. Finally, we examined hatred, a deeper and more enduring emotion than rage that persists as a grudge, bitterness, or a need for revenge. In episode 11, we didn't stop at definitions. We explored these emotions through an example of a couple caught in a destructive cycle. I would like to continue that discussion. So let me first give you a quick refresher, or for those of you who have not yet listened to that content, a brief introduction. We examine how seemingly simple relationship conflicts, and you could fill in the blank here. We focused on a dispute over a credit card purchase. We looked at how that can trigger intense emotional reactions, such as anger that escalates quickly into rage. We analyzed the complexities behind these behaviors, questioning who's in control and who's being controlled, and how do these patterns of aggression and provocation, how do they spiral out of control, blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator? Let's now delve deeper into the topic of rage with a specific focus on narcissistic rage. What is narcissistic rage and how does it present itself? What does it look like, in other words? Narcissistic rage is typically triggered by a perceived threat to one's self-esteem or self-worth. This occurs when they feel criticized, rejected, or humiliated, whether or not the perceived slight is intentional or real. In other words, this could be in one's mind. Such events are known as, and I quote, narcissistic injuries. Because narcissists have a fragile sense of self, they are highly sensitive to any feedback that suggests they're not constantly being considered or are considered as less than perfect or in control. Let's continue with the case example I just reviewed. She made a big purchase on the credit card without first discussing it with him, and he got angry and wanted to talk to her about how he felt they were not working, and I quote, as a team. In the mind of someone who is struggling with narcissistic characteristics, that feeling of togetherness, and I quote again, like consideration and support, is one of the most important things to them. So in this case, her having a mind of her own, making a decision without him, we slowly came to see, left him feeling abandoned. There was a further abandonment when he turned to her to talk about the purchase. It was at this moment she withdrew and didn't want to talk about it. The focus was on what happened next. because he exploded with overt rage. This is a more visible, explosive type of narcissistic rage characterized by yelling, insult, threats, and aggression. Overt rage is aimed at intimidating or overpowering the person or situation that has caused the narcissistic injury. I want to make this point clear. When he got angry at her for making the purchase and tried to talk about it, she withdrew. There were other ways we came to discover that she pulled away, ignored, and withdrew her love from him. This is what I called a sort of passive aggressive rage, but make no mistake, this too can be a form of narcissistic rage, especially since she knew that withdrawing hurt him. Let me say that differently. Sometimes narcissistic rage is more subtle and manifest as passive aggressive behavior. This can include sulking, giving the silent treatment, or engaging in manipulative behaviors designed to punish or regain control without direct confrontation. For instance, she made a large purchase without first discussing it with him, or in another situation, she made plans with friends to take the kids for the weekend without including him in the discussion. This kind of rage has been described as an icy demeanor, a refusal to communicate, and what we see here, emotional withdrawal. Unlike overt rage, this passive rage is about emotional distancing and making the other person feel what? Small or insignificant, like they don't matter. Okay, so those are a few ways in which narcissistic rage presents itself. But now you may be asking, what is the purpose of narcissistic rage? In short, narcissistic rage is a defense mechanism that serves the important function of protecting fragile self esteem. How does it do that? One, it protects the self concept by responding with rage. The narcissist aims to ward off feelings of shame, inadequacy, vulnerability, powerlessness. You could fill in the blank here. We don't always know the feelings because that's the whole point of the rage, is to ward them off. Two, rage is used to reassert dominance over a situation or person, maintaining a sense of power and control. Three, by attacking the perceived source of injury, the narcissist aims to diminish the threat to their what? To their fragile self-esteem. And you may have heard me say this before. The best defense is a strong offense, and that's the narcissistic rage. From a psychodynamic standpoint, narcissistic rage is a result of, and this is number 4, splitting. Narcissists tend to see the world in black or white, right? People are either all good or all bad. You are either with me or you're against me. When someone who was, for instance, idealized disappoints them, they may rapidly devalue that person. We see this when he immediately feels, remember what he said, and I'm quoting, we are not on the same team. So, in other words, if we're not on the same team, you are no longer with me. And what happens when you're not with me? Because of splitting, you are against me. And I'll say more about this in a moment. Kohut, a central figure in understanding narcissistic rage from a psychoanalytic perspective, believed that this rage is a defense mechanism to protect the narcissist, the vulnerable self, from feelings of shame, inadequacy, or humiliation. In his view, narcissistic individuals have not developed a stable sense of self-esteem and often rely heavily on external validation from, and I quote, self-objects. I don't want to get too deep into theory, but in short, self-objects provide functions for the narcissist, right? Such as what? Affirmation, validation, mirroring, and idealization, helping them to maintain self esteem and a cohesive sense of identity. For a person with narcissistic traits, self objects are often used to regulate self esteem and self worth, and they are expected to meet their emotional needs in a way that compensates for deficits in their own internal structure. In other words, when they don't have this ability to carry this within them, this you've heard me say this in prior episodes, it's like this image of the smiling caregiver. If you don't have this and you cannot carry this around, internalize this, then you rely on, and what other people say becomes very important. When this validation is perceived to be threatened or withdrawn, they react what we have been with what this is what I'm calling a narcissistic rage as a way to restore their sense of self-worth and equilibrium. Remember, one of the things I mentioned above was to get control of the other person, right? Can you see how this may have happened or how this whole process that I'm describing with the self object was enacted with this couple? For him, she excluded him in the decision. He felt vulnerable, slighted, and abandoned. So, one can argue he was like a tinderbox waiting to explode. In that moment, his external validation, right, that's the self object, and all the good feelings he received when they were of one mind. Remember what he said? On the same team. Remember, I quoted that earlier. That's of one mind. That's a self object. See, all of that was snatched away from him. She, on the other hand, also lost her external support when he questioned the purchase she made. In the mind of someone who is narcissistically vulnerable, even the most innocent of questions are proof that they are inadequate or they messed up. They're being criticized because they made a mistake of some sort, and therefore they're not perceived as being perfect. But where does this narcissistic rage originate? We already mentioned that narcissistic rage stems from a narcissistic injury. This injury occurs when an event or an interaction threatens the narcissist's self esteem or grandiose self concept. If you want to go a little deeper, we can ask, why are they so vulnerable to narcissistic injuries? And while I tend to stay focused on that which is most present in the room, if we go back further into the history of this vulnerability, research has shown that early childhood experiences and developmental disruptions play a significant role in the vulnerability. Narcissistic rage often originates from early childhood experiences, particularly when a child's emotional needs are not adequately met. In many of my prior episodes, I argued that if a child does not receive sufficient validation, affect attunement, and what is known as emotional resonance from caregivers, essentially the recognition that they are valued and understood, they may develop a fragile sense of self esteem and of self worth. Also, intense feelings of powerlessness and humiliation, among many other complicated mental processes, begins to develop. Many of these feelings of inadequacy are a key source of narcissistic rage, which emerges later in life when these unresolved emotional wounds are triggered by perceived slights or threats. Also, prolonged states of anger and frustration over not being able to change the caregiver's attentiveness interfere with the capability and the capacity to maintain a sense of the, and I quote, good internal object. That's what I mentioned a little bit earlier. Internalizing that representation. Basically, that's all this means when I say good internal object, that one carries around an image of that smiling caregiver. And if you don't have that, this is why being alone or without the affirming presence of another can be quite overwhelming. What I'm trying to say, to borrow from psychoanalytic theory again, there is a deficiency of positive, loving, or comforting interjects. And this word interject, if you stay tuned in an upcoming episode, I'm going to go into that in far more detail. But in essence, what you see is someone who seemingly is really full of rage and anger, and they push the other person away. When they're alone, they feel incredibly uncomfortable. This is the kind of person they'll call you late at night just to talk on the phone, and they don't want to get off the phone with you. Why? Because they don't want to face those feelings of being alone. They're too painfully difficult. So there is a vulnerability to narcissistic injuries, low self esteem, and unmodulated narcissistic rage, which becomes necessary and compensatory when the rage forces the other into giving you something, or the rage rids oneself of the narcissistically unbearable trait that is suddenly exposed to oneself and others, such as I mentioned earlier, the shame, humiliation, loss, powerlessness, etc. Again, we don't know what, because that's the whole point. It's individualized. This is the kind of stuff that has to slowly emerge as we chip away and look beyond the narcissistic rage. Let's delve even further into narcissistic rage. On the surface, it seems like he got angry because he couldn't control her. But I hope you are now beginning to see that on another level, unconsciously, she made him feel powerless and suddenly exposed him to deeper and more complicated feelings. Since, as with all individuals with narcissistic characteristics, self-other differentiation is not fully developed. Rather than seeing this as a problem solely within him, he sees it as her problem. In other words, he doesn't see it as a problem that they have to be on the same team, always on the same team. He punishes her, puts his own feelings or inadequacy or shame or loneliness, whatever it is, where? Where does he put it? Into her. It must sound a bit strange to you, right? But by punishing her, making her the one who is incapable, something is wrong with her. And I quote, "You're ruining this family," unquote. This helps reestablish an equilibrium within himself. Why? Because the problem now lies in her. And he could be like morally, he could feel morally self righteous and superior, if that makes sense. Thereby, he reestablishes his self esteem. And that's the way that the narcissistic rage is compensatory. It overcompensates for these deeper feelings that he never has to see, he never has to face them. He never has that dip in his self esteem because immediately everything negative is put onto her. And when everything negative is on her, everything good and wonderful, guess where that is? That's within him. As discussed earlier, narcissists need others to idealize them to maintain a sense of self-worth. When others fail to fulfill this role, it is experienced not just as a disappointment, but as a direct threat to their self-esteem. Remember, they lose their self-objects, right? It's not just that his wife failed to idealize him or support him, to be on the same team. No, he perceives his failure as an intentional act that causes him direct harm. The narcissist then feels compelled to eliminate or destroy the offending other to restore their sense of stability. By holding others responsible for their feelings, they avoid self-reflection and project all their unresolved issues onto the other person. This projection makes the other person the target of their rage, which is then seen as justified in their minds Why? Why is this justified? Because the other person, and I'm quoting this, caused them, right? It's like, you caused me this emotional pain. Look what you did to me. Okay, so pulling all this together, narcissistic rage is not just a reaction, but it's a form of self defense. It is a response to the deep seated belief that others are responsible for their internal distress. That's the lack of self other differentiation. That's the blurring of the boundaries. The inability to distinguish between their feelings and external reality makes them perceive others as directly causing their emotional pain, which then I said justifies an intense and aggressive reaction. And by the way, that's why it's such an intense reaction and why it's so out of proportion, because the feeling is one of, look what harm you're doing to me. Thinking about it in this way, I believe, strengthens the idea that narcissistic rage is closely tied to projection. By projecting their vulnerabilities onto others, they can avoid confronting their internal weaknesses. The rage serves to attack, right, the projected flaws they see in others, like everybody else. Remember, everything all bad because of splitting is inside somebody else, but they don't recognize that these are actually reflections of their own unresolved inner conflicts around their self-worth and self-esteem. This additional analysis provides, in my perspective, a richer understanding of narcissistic rage by emphasizing how it is what? Rooted in early developmental disruptions and unmet emotional needs. It is a complex defense mechanism aimed at protecting a fragile sense of self worth and self esteem. It's based on the need for self objects and what happens when they no longer serve this function. So, when they no longer serve the function, this becomes intolerable, right? They're exposed to painful feelings, and the rage then is designed to externalize this and project these internal emotional vulnerabilities onto others. And finally, it is the lack of an affirming and supportive environment, which may mean just questioning someone's decision to buy something. See, this is not just failing to meet their needs, but it also constitutes a direct threat on their self worth. So, yes, just asking a question to somebody who is narcissistically vulnerable is a form of an attack in their mind. By combining these elements, we gain a more comprehensive view of why narcissistic rage is so intense and disproportionate. Understanding the rage not only helps us comprehend the behavior of individuals with narcissistic traits, but it also challenges us to consider how we might respond differently when confronted with such dynamics. How might we better navigate these intense interactions to foster more constructive and healing outcomes? Now, I want to make clear, I'm not suggesting, I think you know this already, but just in case, that someone stays in a relationship with a narcissistically abusive person when things are not changing, right? Or that you're feeling threatened in some way, or that you should tolerate this behavior, right? That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I do believe is that understanding the rage as a defense mechanism rooted in deep seated vulnerabilities allows us to see beyond the behavior and recognize the underlying emotional distress. So, what, you may be asking? What if I do recognize that? What's that going to do for me? What I think and what I see is by acknowledging this, it then, only then, let me say, becomes possible to connect with the underlying vulnerability, and therefore we can avoid escalating the conflict. In other words, we can help to de escalate tensions and create opportunities for more meaningful communication. At least that's the way I work with narcissistic rage. And this is precisely what happened with the couple in the case example we were just following. As I was able to help them see and understand these dynamics, along with highlighting the importance of recognizing projection and owning their previously split off feelings, what emerged were healthier dynamics and constructive engagement. Anyway, look, I know this stuff inevitably is complex, but we need to start wrapping it up. As always, I encourage you to reach out with any questions or comments regarding rage, which is very complicated. This topic, I know I could probably do another episode on this, and maybe I'll go into this again when I talk about, I mentioned I would get back to introjects. So stay tuned for that. That will help flush this out a bit more, as does splitting, which I have to spend a little bit more time on as well. But we have to save that for next time. If you want additional information on this specific topic of narcissistic rage, I just recorded a continuing education seminar, which is like a full hour of this. So stay tuned for that. All this stuff can be found on my website, which is linked below. Okay, until next time, engage your mind and not your weapon. Your weapon being what? Your rageful response. Okay, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.